Hi everyone! Are you a perfectionist? Do you find yourself constantly striving for perfection in everything you do, never feeling satisfied with anything less than flawless? If so, you're not alone. Perfectionism is a common trait that affects people of all ages and backgrounds. It's the constant pursuit of flawlessness, setting impossibly high standards for yourself, and striving to meet those standards no matter the cost. In today's video, we're going to be talking about everything you ever wanted to know about perfectionism. But before I get into that, just a couple of disclaimers to go over. I'm a registered psychologist with the province of British Columbia, Canada, and this video is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute or replacement for advice from your doctor or mental health professional. Now, with those things out of the way, let's start talking about perfectionism. Today's video is a compilation video, putting together 3 previous videos that I've made on the topic of perfectionism. The first section is going to be talking about what perfectionism is and the 3 main types of perfectionism. The second section is going to review why perfectionism is so damaging and destructive and the various ways that it can negatively impact your life. But we're not just going to talk about the problem of perfectionism. The third section of this video talks about practical tips and strategies for coping with perfectionism and learning to embrace imperfection. So whether you're a perfectionist yourself, or you know someone that is, or if you're just interested in learning more about this fascinating topic, I hope you'll find this video helpful. So let's get started by talking about what perfectionism actually is. The first thing we need to start with is talking about a definition of perfectionism. What is perfectionism? Well, perfectionism is a personality trait characterized by the unrelenting pursuit of flawlessness and setting extremely high standards for yourself or for other people. People with perfectionism often have an obsessive need to get things right and might be highly critical of themselves and others when they don't meet those really high standards. Now, in some cases, reasonable amounts of perfectionism can be a positive trait, as it can lead to hard work and strict attention to detail. But it can also be harmful when it leads to unrealistic expectations, fear of failure, paralysis, and difficulty getting things done. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't realize about perfectionism is that it's often rooted in fear. People who struggle with perfectionism often have a deep-seated fear of failure, rejection, or even success. They believe that if they don't do everything perfectly, they'll be judged or criticized by others, or that they'll lose control over their lives. It's also important to note that perfectionism isn't the same, and it's not the same thing as striving for excellence. People often think of perfectionism and striving for excellence as the same thing, but they're actually quite different. Perfectionism is characterized by this need for flawlessness, extremely high standards, and it's driven by that fear of failure and need to avoid criticism. Whereas striving for excellence is different. It's about setting goals for yourself and working towards them in a healthy and productive way. Striving for excellence focuses on personal growth and development, and it involves setting goals that are challenging but achievable. And that's the key point. Striving for excellence can be motivating, and it can lead to a person to develop a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. It doesn't involve that obsessive need to be perfect or the fear of failure, and it doesn't rely on unhealthy coping mechanisms like avoidance and rumination, which are things you often see in perfectionism. So while striving for excellence can lead to personal growth and a sense of accomplishment, perfectionism often leaves a person feeling frozen, stuck, and burnt out. Now, when we talk about perfectionism, it's important to recognize that there are different types of perfectionism. And depending on the type of perfectionism that you might have, it's going to lead to very different types of experiences. So the first type of perfectionism is something referred to as self-oriented perfectionism. And this is the type of perfectionism that people often think about when they hear the term perfectionism. In self-oriented perfectionism, you have really high personal standards and expectations for yourself. You strive for excellence in everything that you do, and you have a strong desire to achieve these high goals. This type of perfectionism may involve things like working really long hours and sacrificing areas of your personal life to ensure that you can reach these lofty expectations and objectives. But it can also result in you being very critical of yourself, and you may feel like you're never good enough. This type of perfectionism can leave people prone to anxiety and depression as they experience intense feelings of shame or guilt when they don't meet these incredibly lofty and aspirational expectations. An example of this is a student who sets a goal of getting straight A's all the time. Now, that's a lofty and admirable goal. And the student wants to perform well, they want to do their best. So that in and of itself isn't a bad thing. The problem is when that student receives 1B on a test, and then they beat themselves up and feel like a complete failure. As a result, they might study obsessively, sacrificing important aspects of their life, like spending time with friends or getting enough sleep, to make sure that they don't make any mistakes and are hyper prepared for any test or assignment. So that's self-oriented perfectionism. The second type of perfectionism is something called other-oriented perfectionism. And in this type of perfectionism, it involves having really high expectations for other people and expecting other people to meet those lofty standards. People who are other-oriented perfectionists are often hypercritical of other people and may become frustrated or angry when their high expectations of other people aren't being met. And this can result in strain to relationships with other people, as other people might feel like they're being judged or criticized by the perfectionist. And for good reason, because they probably are being judged and criticized by the other-oriented perfectionist. For people with other-oriented perfectionism, they may struggle with delegating tasks as they feel that they can't trust other people to meet their very high and lofty standards and expectations. Now, you may have come across this in bosses that you've had. Bosses who are other-oriented perfectionists will expect their employees to work at the same level of perfectionism that they do, and they might become angry or disappointed when their employees make mistakes. These types of bosses may micromanage their employees and expect them to work long hours or do a lot of unpaid overtime in order to achieve their unrealistic expectations of what should be accomplished. These types of bosses, they're not great to work for. And the third type of perfectionism is something called socially prescribed perfectionism. Now, this type of perfectionism is driven by external pressures, such as societal expectations or the perceived expectations of other people. People who are socially prescribed perfectionists feel like they need to meet certain standards in order to be accepted or valued by other people. And this can lead to high levels of anxiety and stress, as they might feel like they're constantly under scrutiny. Socially prescribed perfectionists may also feel like they can't express their true selves, as they may feel like they need to conform to a certain image or persona in order to fit in or to be accepted by other people. An example of this is a social media influencer who feels like they need to maintain a perfect image and to be constantly flawless in order to gain more followers. Constantly flawless to keep those followers interested and to keep up a particular reputation. They may carefully Photoshop any images of themselves or feel like they can't post anything that's not perfectly curated and that matches their carefully considered social image. As you can imagine, this can be extremely exhausting as the person can never be their true selves and always has to be what they think other people expect them to be. So those are the three main types of perfectionism. And you might be wondering, well, okay, I understand that, but how do I tell if I'm just a perfectionist? How do I tell if I'm a perfectionist or just a really high achiever? What are the signs and symptoms of perfectionism that I want to look out for? Now, there are a number of things, another number of signs that you might be a perfectionist. Things like setting extremely high standards for yourself and other people. I've talked about this. This is kind of a core feature of perfectionism. If you're overly self-critical or highly critical of other people. You might be a perfectionist if you procrastinate or avoid doing things due to fear of failure. If I don't know that I can do it perfectly, I'm not going to do it. Engaging in unhealthy coping mechanisms such as ruminating or avoidance when faced with perceived imperfections. I made a mistake on that test and I keep thinking about how I could have gotten that question wrong. What was wrong with me? How could I have screwed that up? You might be experiencing perfectionism if you have difficulty completing tasks or projects because you have to go over them again and again and again to make sure that everything is perfect and that there is no room for error. This can make a person extremely inefficient. You might have difficulty enjoying achievements or successes. If I get 98% on that math test, I get frustrated and upset with myself about that one question that I got wrong. And this takes any sense of joy or accomplishment or reward out of getting 98%. I forget about the 49 questions that I got right, and I get down on myself about that one question that I got wrong. You may experience problems in relationships because you have really high standards for other people and they get frustrated with you because you're constantly being critical of them for not living up to those very high standards. You may be a perfectionist if you hold a belief that making a mistake or having some sort of flaw is completely unacceptable and that it must be avoided at all costs. This is a cognitive symptom of perfectionism, an attitude and assumption about yourself and the world that revolves around a belief that things can and must be perfect in order for everything to be okay. You may struggle to delegate tasks or to ask other people for help due to the belief that you have to do everything yourself in order to make sure that it's perfect. Therefore, I have to take on everything, which just sets me up for being overworked and burnt out. And I can't ask other people for help because that might come across as a sign of weakness or a flaw that maybe I can't do it all myself. You may have difficulty making decisions due to a belief or an assumption that there is only one perfect option. Imagine a college student who's trying to choose a major and is struggling because they believe that there's only one perfect major that's going to lead to a successful career and a happy life. The college student spends hours researching different majors, trying to find the one that fits the criteria for perfection, making a pros and cons list for each major, analyzing each one to the tiniest detail, and still can't make a decision. The student is paralyzed by their belief that there is only one perfect option and is terrified that if they choose the wrong major, they're going to be stuck in a career that they hate and that they'll never be able to achieve their goals for their life. As a result, they're paralyzed to make any decision. You might find yourself overly concerned with the opinions of other people and are constantly looking to seek validation or approval from others. If you make a post on social media, you keep careful track of how many people have liked that post or how many people have reacted to it. And usually, it's never enough. And you're left wanting, wishing that more people had reacted to your post. Another common symptom or sign of perfectionism is being inflexible and resistant to change due to a belief that there's only one right way of doing things and that this right way is the only way to do it. You may have a boss at work who believes that his way of doing things is the only correct way, and he expects his team members and you to follow his lead without question. He's resistant to any changes or new ideas that come from his team, and he thinks that those ideas won't be as effective as the way he wants it to be done. Have you ever had a boss like that? How do you feel about working for somebody like that? Probably not great, as this type of other-oriented perfectionism style just leads to people becoming frustrated and demotivated. Now, if you've watched any of my videos on intolerance of uncertainty, you might recognize that there's a fair bit of overlap between perfectionism and intolerance of uncertainty. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If you can do things perfectly, it eliminates any sense of uncertainty in a situation because you've achieved perfectionism. Because you've achieved perfection. But just like with intolerance of uncertainty, you can never fully eliminate uncertainty from the situation. And similarly with perfectionism, you can never know for certain that you've done something perfectly. It's a no-win game, and it can contribute to feelings of anxiety, depression, and discontentment because it's never enough. Now, sports stars and celebrities typically get to their career heights through a lot of hard work and very high expectations and demands of themselves. And when asked about how they achieved their greatness, they often give examples of perfectionism. Oprah Winfrey once said in an interview, "I always knew I wanted to be excellent in everything I did. I knew that I had to be my best self, and that's what I tried to do every day." In an interview with CBS, Tom Brady once said, "I always try to think of ways to do things better. It's a constant pursuit of excellence." Now, while it's understandable to want to be the best version of yourself, it's also important to recognize when this mindset becomes harmful and actually starts to negatively impact your life and your emotional well-being. When we hear celebrities like Oprah or Tom Brady talk about their pursuit of perfection, it sounds really, really good, and it sounds like something we should strive for. But the reality is, constantly trying to pursue excellence or having to be excellent in everything that you do can be extremely harmful to yourself and to other people. So, what are the impacts of perfectionism? In what ways does perfectionism have a negative impact on your life? Well, first of all, perfectionism makes it really difficult to complete tasks or projects. It becomes really challenging to actually get anything done when you're a perfectionist. Perfectionists often have an unrelenting desire to produce flawless work, which can cause them to set incredibly high standards for themselves and their products, their job products. Now, like I said, having high standards in and of itself isn't a bad thing, as this can lead to really great achievements. But the problem arises when these really high standards become so rigid that they interfere with progress. For a perfectionist, every detail of a task or project is important and it must be perfect. And this can cause a person to become overwhelmed with the sheer number of details that they need to attend to. And they may struggle to prioritize which tasks are actually the most important. They may also spend an excessive amount of time on one task or detail in an effort to perfect it, which can then lead to a lack of progress on other tasks. And as a result, you might find yourself struggling to complete a project or task on time or to get it done at all. And this can be particularly problematic in situations where deadlines are tight or the task is time sensitive. Additionally, the constant striving for perfection can cause procrastination as you become increasingly worried about making mistakes or not meeting your high standards. And what this does is it creates a vicious cycle of self-doubt, avoidance, and further procrastination. Now, another problem that comes with perfectionism is that it makes it really difficult to enjoy any of your achievements or successes. Perfectionists tend to set very high standards for themselves, and with these high standards comes a belief that anything less than perfect is unacceptable. So what this means is that even when you achieve success or accomplish a big goal, you may struggle to fully appreciate your accomplishment. You can't feel proud and satisfied with what you've accomplished because you focus on any perceived flaws or mistakes in the work and become overly critical of yourself because of it. Now, another thing that can happen with perfectionism is that you compare your achievements to those of other people, and in doing so, you might feel that you're falling short in some way. This can lead to feelings of inadequacy and can contribute to you doubting your abilities or feeling like you could have done better, even if you did really, really well, even if you did great. Because fear of failure is often a driving force behind perfectionism, this can make it really difficult for you to fully enjoy your successes. You might worry that, sure, I achieved this goal, but what if I'm not able to replicate this success in the future? Or what if I make a mistake that's going to now tarnish these accomplishments? As a result, it makes it almost impossible for you to enjoy achievement. It makes it impossible for you to enjoy success. If you're a perfectionist, you may feel like you're never quite good enough or that you can always do better, which leads to constant feelings of dissatisfaction and an inability to find happiness in your accomplishments. One of the other big ways that perfectionism can negatively impact a person's life is the impact that it has on your relationships. And there are a number of ways in which perfectionism can negatively impact relationships. The first is, perfectionists can have unrealistic expectations for themselves and other people, which can cause frustration and disappointment in their relationships. You may expect your partner or your friends to be perfect like you, and you might become critical or demanding when they fall short of your expectations. And understandably, this can lead to a fair bit of conflict and tension in your relationships. For example, you might find yourself overly critical of a friend's choices or behaviors. And what this does is it results in your friend feeling judged and unsupported by you, and it can lead to a lack of trust in the relationship. Now, you might feel that you're just trying to help your friend improve, but they see it as criticism, and as a result, they now become defensive and mistrustful of you. Perfectionism can also lead to difficulties with vulnerability in relationships. You might find yourself struggling being vulnerable in a romantic relationship out of fear that if you reveal any flaws or mistakes, this is going to lead to your partner rejecting you. And as a result, you may keep your emotions bottled up, or you may avoid expressing your true feelings or needs to your partner. And what this can do is create distance and lack of emotional intimacy in your relationships. One of the underlying features of perfectionism is the fear of failure, and this can extend to your relationships. You might worry about being the perfect partner or friend, and you become overly self-critical or defensive when you make a perceived mistake. So, for example, I accidentally burned toast in the toaster oven, and then become critical of my wife for distracting me from the toast, and that's what caused it to be burned. So the perfectionism can make it difficult for me to apologize or take responsibility for my actions. I just wasn't paying attention for the toast, but because I can't acknowledge that I made a mistake, I blame my wife for it. And what this can do is it can damage the trust and create a sense of resentment in our relationship. Perfectionism can also lead to control issues in relationships. You might find yourself with a tendency to be overly controlling in your relationships as you feel that your way is the only right way. You might become critical of your friends' choices or behaviors and try to tell them how they should be doing things or how they should be living their lives. And understandably, this can create a sense of resentment in relationships. Now, aside from relationships, another big problem with perfectionism is that it can lead to difficulty making decisions because perfectionism tends to come with the belief that there is only one perfect option or solution to a particular situation. You might find yourself becoming so focused on finding the ideal choice that you struggle to make any decision at all. And this can cause significant stress and anxiety, especially in situations when time is a factor or when the decision has big or significant consequences. For example, imagine that I'm trying to decide on a vacation destination. I research extensively, seeking out the perfect balance of a vacation that involves adventure, relaxation, and cultural experiences. I might analyze and compare prices, look at all of the different accommodation options and activities, and try to find the absolute best option. However, as this decision-making process drags on, I might find myself becoming increasingly stressed and anxious. I might start to get worried about making the wrong choice or missing out on a better opportunity, and eventually become paralyzed in this analysis and unable to make any decision at all, and ultimately missing out on the chance to actually take that vacation. In more significant decisions, like choosing a career path or making a major life change or committing to a relationship, perfectionism can cause even more significant difficulties. I might find myself being so focused on finding the perfect option that I struggle to move forward or make any decision at all, leading to missed opportunities, lost time, and ultimately significant regrets in my life. Now, you've probably already guessed or can recognize that perfectionism can also lead to significant mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. Perfectionists tend to set extremely high standards for themselves and can experience anxiety and depression when they fall short of those unrealistic standards. And this creates a cycle of self-doubt and negative self-talk that can chip away at your self-esteem over time. By setting these extremely high goals and unrealistic expectations, you're guaranteeing that you're going to fail to meet those expectations, which contributes to feelings of worthlessness, self-doubt, inadequacy, and a belief that you're never going to be able to succeed because you can never reach those lofty expectations that you have of yourself. Think of what this might do to your self-esteem and sense of self-worth when you feel like you're constantly striving for perfection, but you're never, ever good enough. Perfectionism is also associated with control issues, as perfectionists feel that they need to control every aspect of their lives in order to achieve this perfection in all of their goals. And this can create a tremendous sense of pressure to have to be on top of everything and having to control everything, that it can become overwhelming and fuel anxiety and depression. Perfectionism is also linked to eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia. People with perfectionism become fixated on achieving the perfect body, which leads to an unhealthy focus on diet, exercise, and weight loss. And this can spiral into disordered eating patterns and dangerous behaviors like purging or excessive fasting. And finally, perfectionism often leads to burnout at work, because perfectionists tend to have an all-or-nothing mindset when it comes to achieving goals. You might find yourself working long hours, sacrificing self-care, and pushing yourself to the brink of exhaustion in order to achieve your high standards, high goals, and high expectations of yourself. You may work really long hours at the office, bringing work home and sacrificing time with your friends and family in order to meet these remarkable standards. You may feel that you need to be available at all times, respond to emails immediately, and never take a day off. And over time, this level of intensity and pressure can lead to you burning out. You may feel exhausted, overwhelmed, and constantly stressed out. And as a result, you start to lose interest in your work. You may feel a sense of disillusionment or resentment towards work as you feel that all of your hard work isn't paying off the way you'd hoped. You might see other people, coworkers that you work with, getting promotions and getting advances even though they don't work as hard as you do. You might start to question whether all of the sacrifices you've made were worth it, and then experience a sense of disappointment or a sense of, what was the point of all of that? It's unfortunately a pattern I've seen over and over again in some of the clients I've worked with. Now look, I know this might sound counterintuitive, but perfection should never be a goal. And the simple reason for that is because perfection is impossible. And if you set goals that are impossible to achieve, all that's going to do is set you up for disappointment, dissatisfaction, and failure. If you recognize that you struggle with perfectionism, what can you do about it? What can you do to cope and manage perfectionism? Well, the first thing to do is to set realistic expectations for yourself. One of the biggest traps of perfectionism is setting impossibly high standards for yourself, or setting really high but unattainable goals. You see this in students who set the goal of getting straight A's in all of their classes, even though that can be extremely challenging or potentially unlikely. Or if you're a YouTuber, you might set the goal of blowing up your channel and getting 1 million subscribers within the next year, when realistically, that might take years to do if it's even possible. So instead of setting these impossibly high standards, the idea is to break down your larger goals into smaller, more manageable tasks. If your goal is to get straight A's in all of your courses, set the smaller goal of getting an A on your next quiz or on your next paper. If your goal is to blow up your YouTube channel, set a smaller goal of making 1 video a week for the next 2 months. These are far more realistic and doable goals that you're more likely to actually get done. It's also important to set deadlines for yourself that are challenging but achievable. If you have a paper that's due in a couple of weeks, set the goal of having to have it finished a few days before the deadline so you have a little bit of time to review and edit the paper. This gives you some wiggle room in case things don't go as planned. Another important aspect of setting realistic expectations and goals is to make sure that your goals are specific and measurable so you can evaluate whether or not you're actually making progress towards them. And what this can do is help you stay on track and see how far you've actually come. If your goal is to get into better shape, set a measurable goal like running a certain distance or lifting a certain weight. Then you can track your progress and celebrate each milestone along the way that you reach. And as you're going through this process of setting realistic expectations for yourself, it's important to recognize when you're putting too much pressure on yourself and adjust your expectations and your goals accordingly. Take it one step at a time and be encouraging to yourself along the way, similar to how you might react to your best friend in that situation. So for example, if you're feeling overwhelmed with a project that you're working on for work, take a break from it and do something that you enjoy rather than just bearing down and feeling like you just have to power through this. Another way to cope with perfectionism is to, as challenging as it sounds, embrace imperfection. Now I know that might sound weird and counterintuitive, but it's important to remember that no one is perfect, and our mistakes and imperfections are what make us human. And one way to embrace imperfection is to view mistakes as opportunities for growth and learning. Instead of beating yourself up over a mistake, think about ways you can learn from it and use it as a chance to improve and to grow. For example, if you make a mistake at work, use it as an opportunity to review and break down what actually took place. By going through this review and debriefing process, you can figure out where things broke down and avoid making the same type of mistake in the future. Another way to embrace imperfection is to remind yourself of your strengths and accomplishments. One of the problems with perfectionism is that we tend to view ourselves in very black and white ways. If I'm not perfect, then I'm a complete failure. But that's not the case. You can still be capable and successful, even though not everything you do is perfect. Think about past successes and recognize that you achieved those successes through hard work and perseverance, not through perfection. Rather than focusing solely on what went wrong or mistakes that you've made, consider those mistakes in the context of everything you've done and the successes and all of the successes that you've achieved. One of the most common ways I see this is in students with incredibly high standards for themselves. They may get 49 out of 50 on a test and beat themselves up over that one question that they got wrong. So what I do is encourage them to think about the mistake that they made on that one question, but to also consider it in the context of the other 49 questions that they got right. And one of the ways you could develop this more balanced view of mistakes and setbacks is to surround yourself with people who accept you for who you are, mistakes and all. This means building relationships with people who are supporting and encouraging rather than people who judge or criticize you. Sometimes perfectionism is a result of critical and unrealistic feedback we get from other people who may be punishing and harsh whenever we make mistakes. So it's important to seek out friends, family members, or mentors who you can talk to about your struggles with perfectionism and who can help you see the bigger picture. Related to this, it's important to practice self-compassion as a way of combating perfectionism. And what I mean by self-compassion is treating yourself with the same level of kindness, understanding, and empathy that you would offer to a good friend who's struggling or a good friend who made a mistake. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be imagining a good friend, but just any other person. It's remarkable how harsh and critical we can be with ourselves, but we would never think or talk that way to someone else. So instead of engaging in harsh self-criticism or negative self-talk, think about ways of offering yourself that encouragement and support. One practical way to practice self-compassion is to start by acknowledging your emotions and your feelings. We tend not to be very good at this, and oftentimes we're not even aware of what we're feeling. For example, if you're feeling overwhelmed, take a moment to recognize that you're feeling overwhelmed and to acknowledge the feeling. You might say to yourself something like, I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now, and that makes a lot of sense because I'm trying to do 15 things all at once. Most people would feel overwhelmed if they were in this situation right now. Another way to practice self-compassion is to take care of yourself physically and emotionally. I talk a lot about having a sustainable lifestyle and making sure that you're putting fuel in your gas tank so that you don't burn out. This means things like getting enough sleep, eating a healthy diet, engaging in regular exercise, and doing things for fun. It means taking breaks when you need some and allowing yourself time to relax and do things that bring you joy, like reading a book, going for a walk, or spending time with friends and family. Not every moment of your life needs to be productive or having to achieve something, which is what I often see in people with perfectionism. So self-compassion means allowing yourself some time to do things for you and not always having to engage in instrumental goals or activities, otherwise you're not achieving your best. And inevitably, you're going to make a mistake or fall short of your expectations. Welcome to the club, we all do. I've previously done a video on this in which I talked about coaching style and how we tend to be extremely harsh and critical coaches with ourselves. We have this mistaken belief that the more critical and demanding of ourselves that we are, that's the path to us improving and being more successful in what we do. When in reality, all this really does is demotivate a person and makes it more difficult to succeed. If you want to check out that video, I'll put a link to it above. Now, another important tool in managing perfectionism is to challenge negative thoughts that fuel and drive our perfectionism. So the first thing you need to do is to recognize and acknowledge when you're engaging in negative self-talk that might be fueling perfectionism. Write down some of these thoughts or say them out loud to yourself so that you're explicit in terms of what these thoughts actually are. For example, you might catch yourself saying, I'm such a failure. I can never get anything right. And once you've identified that negative thought, the key is to now examine it, evaluate the thought, and challenge the negative thought. Ask yourself, is this thought accurate or helpful? Are there other perspectives or other evidence that contradicts this negative thought? So for example, if you catch yourself thinking the thought, I'm such a failure, ask yourself, is that really true? Is it true that you have never succeeded at anything in your life and that you have always and forever been a failure? Can you think of any accomplishments or any achievements that you've ever had? And if so, that contradicts this negative thought and demonstrates that you're not actually a failure. Related to this, another way to challenge negative self-talk is to replace it with a more realistic thought. Now, the key thing is, this isn't the power of positive thinking. This is the power of realistic thinking. So, for example, if you're thinking, I can never get anything right, try to come up with a more realistic thought, such as, yeah, sometimes I make mistakes, but I also have a lot of strengths and accomplishments. So you see, this isn't entirely positive thinking. I'm acknowledging that I make mistakes, but I'm also acknowledging that I succeed sometimes and I accomplish things as well. It's a much more balanced and realistic way of thinking. Challenging negative self-talk, it takes practice and it takes patience, in large part because what I'm talking about here is thinking about your thinking, which is something we typically aren't very good at. And this is a tool called cognitive therapy. And I've done a number of videos on identifying and challenging negative thinking patterns. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I'd encourage you to check out those videos. And the last tool I want to talk about in terms of coping with perfectionism is to focus on your progress, not perfection. I talked earlier about the importance of setting realistic goals and working towards those goals. As you achieve your goals, it's important to celebrate the small successes and milestones along the way. If your goal is to run a marathon, the idea isn't to just celebrate once you cross that finish line, but to celebrate the various steps that get you to that finish line. Celebrate each time you increase your distance or improve your time or run a particular pace. So while it's important to stay focused on the long-term goals, the idea is to enjoy the journey and the progress that you're making. Progress takes time. These big goals and achievements, they aren't accomplished in one day. And so it really is about recognizing the process that you're going through and continuing to stay motivated because you're seeing the small successes rather than just the setbacks or how far you still need to go. By focusing on your progress, your emphasis is on your own personal growth and development. You're setting your standards and measuring progress against your own goals. Avoid comparing yourself to other people, as this often leads to feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt. It's really common in perfectionism to set our standards against the accomplishment of other people, and usually other people who are hyper successful. And if those are the standards that you're setting for yourself, you're invariably going to fail to achieve those standards. And then you're going to beat yourself up and get down on yourself. So it's key to set your own standards and measure your progress against yourself, not other people. Look, perfectionism is a mindset, an unhealthy, unrealistic, and destructive mindset. So the key is to develop more accurate, realistic expectations of yourself that allow for you to embrace the possibility of mistakes and failures, because that's one of the things that makes us human and one of the key ways in which we grow. So there you have it, everything you may have ever wanted to know about perfectionism. If there's anything that I didn't cover in the video or anything you'd like to know more about with regards to perfectionism, please leave me some comments in the comments section down below. If you want to learn more about a topic that's closely related to perfectionism, I'd encourage you to check out this video on intolerance of uncertainty. As always, thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I'll see you in the next one.